Thanks, David. It's a whistle-stop tour
Yeah.
into the world of gaming and an insight into your childhood there as well. You covered a huge and growing area there, and I think you've highlighted this rapidly changing nature of online finance and the associated risks and harms that might occur from that. It seems that the way that children can make, spend and lose money online is fundamentally shifted from previous generations as well. And digital is a particular element of that, as your work has shown. But at the same time, it feels like our understanding of this space, you've just touched on some of the most recent research, but our understanding of this space and our responses to that are kind of quite far behind where the real lived experience for children and families are. Thinking about those reviews that were on there, and then the gambling regulation. So I just wonder, Jono, from PSHE Association and your previous work, do you feel that our understanding, children's understanding around financial online harms, is behind the curve in this?
Yes.
Thanks.
I mean, I think just when you think you've caught up, something else comes out to bite. I mean, I think when I think about this, I think it's quite useful to think about where we were with online child sexual exploitation in the sort of late 90s, early noughties, where what we had was effectively a kind of fundamental shift that was enabled by the internet. And that was really simple. It was just the fact that for the first time, children could communicate with unknown adults, and that came with a whole range of other issues. And of course, there were loads of other shifts of sort of digitization of images, but fundamentally, that was the thing that suddenly put children at risk of a type of harm that we hadn't seen in that way before. And obviously that led to a huge amount of work and activity. You had the Home Secretary's task force in the early noughties, you had the creation of CEOP, you had the creation of UKIS, and huge range of activity, so that we're now all pretty familiar with this as a type of harm. There's education work, there's policy work, there's regulatory work, and it feels really what we're seeing again here is another sort of paradigm shift. And I suppose if we think about prior to, I mean, not even prior to the internet, but sort of, if we were thinking 10 years ago, you tend to think about children's engagement with money and the market as primarily being mediated by their parents. That fundamentally it was, how's the parent giving them money? Does the child have access to their parent's credit card? But now, through gaming and through a whole range of other ways in which children can effectively interact with systems of value online, we now see that they have that direct connection. And again, of course, this is entirely facilitated by the internet and by the incentives as well, because of course this is all about following the money. And I think, as David really clearly showed, that we've always been worried about advertising as the fundamental business model of the internet, but of course other business models emerge, and that's sort of what we're seeing now. I think there's the gaming piece, but there's also just the fact that there are now many different ways to exchange forms of value online, whether we're talking about skin gambling and taking what you've got out of a loot box and then selling that on a third-party site, or if we're even talking about things like crypto. And the way that the internet seems to be developing, particularly for services aimed at children, is one in which transactions are becoming a really fundamental part of the financial ecosystem. So if you think about Roblox, for instance, again, hugely popular with young people, has aspirations to be the platform for the metaverse, if that's ever going to happen, is now employing Web3 developers, which means they're directly looking at the integration of crypto into their platform, which again, that's, these are decisions that companies will make, but these are also children's playgrounds. And I think that's where we are far behind this. So I think, again, if we look back at where we were in the early noughties with child sexual exploitation and abuse online, we need to be thinking about not just, I think, David put the kind of panoply of potential solutions, and I think we need to throw all of them at it. Yes, I mean, self-regulation is not going to work because of the money and the incentives. The time that regulation will take, they'll be making more money, so we need to do exactly what we did with all of the issues, other issues on the internet, and that's create the kind of policy networks, create the organizations, create the thinking, and in the places where finance is kind of running through, in the financial industry, in the banking industry, to create that understanding as well.
I think it does seem that children have a new or a less recognised autonomy in being able to make, spend and lose money online. And thinking about the work that you do at SciFast, I was struck by one of the things that a 14-year-old can be placed on the National Fraud Database. So just wondering, that autonomy comes then with ending up on a fraud database. How does that happen? How does a 14-year-old end up as a fraudster?
So there's obviously so many ways that fraud can be committed. One of the main ways that we would see fraudulent conduct when it comes to children is the activity whereby they are sharing their bank account. I'm sure if I asked any of you here and said, my bank card's not working, can you lend me your card, can you lend me your PIN number, you wouldn't do it, because we know as adults that you don't lend your bank account, it's a priceless facility, whereas children don't see that risk. And the problem that they're then having is they're lending their card and PIN number to a friend who says, oh, I've lost my card, I've lost my PIN number, can I use yours? And there's funds that are being placed through that account, being withdrawn, and actually they were fraudulent funds, and those funds have gone. It sits then with the account holder, who is that child who allowed their bank account to be used by somebody else. It could well be that we're seeing, for example, somebody's owed some money and there's funds that are transferred into that account, £500. Well, I owe you £50 for that gig ticket, so my mum's transferred me 500, so keep the 50, and then if you can just transfer the rest out to me. Actually, that's not from the mum, that's from some scheme that they've been groomed into online, and they're fraudulent funds. There's a lot of different ways that we're seeing that, and it could even be as simple as somebody just saying, I need to borrow your card, I need to borrow your banking facilities. One of the cases that I've seen that's really, it stayed with me over the years because of the damaging effect that it had on this child, was she was approached at school, and so she was school age, she was approached by a friend who said, can I use your bank account? And she allowed that bank account to be used. She actually gave them the PIN number and the card, didn't ever ask for that card back. There was funds that went through that account, which was a misuse of facility for that bank account. There were fraudulent funds, went through that bank account. Next thing, there's a letter from the bank saying your banking facilities are going to be closed because you've misused that facility. We're also filing you to a fraud prevention database as well. And she seemed to think that if she didn't ever mention it to anybody, it would go away. So she hid the letters from her parents, who potentially could have helped her at that point. And she just kept it hidden, never told anybody. And when it came then that she applied for her first job, and it was with a reputable company, actually that came back to bite her because she was at risk of being declined for that. So it's not even just about your bank account, it's about the knock-on effects that actually it can stop you from being able to get a job. It can stop you from being able to open an insurance policy when you get your first car. There's so many different areas that parents and children probably aren't aware of, that when it comes to fraudulent activity with a bank account, it's not just a case of your bank account's closed and that's it. It's those knock-on effects that I think definitely aren't understood.
It's obviously quite a complex area that covers into both traditional finance and, as David's shown, with kind of loot boxes and cosmetics, kind of non-monetary value items, the kind of skins, etc. It seems such a complex area. Where might we start, David, in terms of addressing some of these?
I actually think in this room. So I think that if you go back 4 or 5 years, I would have said the right place to start in this case is top-down, government regulation, because we had a number of very functional, or what appeared very functional, select committee inquiries. You might remember the Immersive and Addictive Technologies Select Committee, or the House of Lords had a select committee about the gambling industry that incorporated this kind of evidence too. And it really felt as if the regulatory wheels within government were turning and they were going to do something appropriate. Now I'm a bit war-torn, actually, and a bit embittered. Tens of thousands of people have written to the government talking about video games and issues with their monetization. The government has swallowed these in a consultation for years, and then at the end of that very long process decided that the right thing to do is that the video games industry should self-regulate itself. So it should sort of just decide what's best for it and do that. It's a process that's very unconvincing, and therefore I think change has to start somewhere else. So I think change can start in schools, and I think the stuff that Jono does and talks about is incredibly effective and useful. We can give young people the skills to understand their own worlds rather than cordon off products from the top down. Or change can start with parents as well. But I think parents need to be supported here. And I think that's where organizations like ParentZone are particularly helpful, actually. So like, if you're on the Google Play Store, it's really hard for you to spot games that might pose a severe financial risk to your children. Games which do something like build dependency on microtransactions. So you start out just having to pay a few, and then every month you pay a bit more until eventually you're paying thousands of pounds. And we do see people spending tens of thousands of pounds in these games. So organizations like yours are crucial in disseminating this information that platform providers and tech companies and stakeholders from the games industry don't appear to be doing an adequate job of.
John, do you see that? David mentioned about the education work that PSHE does. You do financial education at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, again, in terms of us being behind the curve on these issues, financial education is certainly not yet good enough in this country. There are sort of statutory requirements in maths, but of course learning the maths isn't really going to help you because this is about behavior, this is about incentives, but from a powerfully driven industry. But even the financial education that we're looking at tends to be much more focused on personal budgeting, goal setting, sort of things, not incorporating this. And of course, in PSHE, there's the perfect opportunity to link this across to the other teaching that you're doing about digital technologies, about how you go about living life, which is completely mediated by online technologies. But I think also we do need to push that further. We did some work. I was really struck by the sort of the links with online gambling in terms of what would be effective in teaching here. And there are things that are done in gambling education, so sort of teaching kind of the gambler's fallacy. So the idea that just because if something hasn't happened for ages, it might happen again, which is a misunderstanding of the laws of randomness, or teaching superstitious thinking. But I think again, a lot of this inevitably comes back to what extent is this a threat to children's agency and autonomy? And as you say, if you're being sort of weaned into a process of relying on microtransactions and seeing that as something which is thrilling, getting your loot box, then that's something which really needs to be addressed. So there's parallels with work done in online gambling, but I think there's also some new areas we need to think about. And again, cross-cutting. So yes, there's the massive issue with gaming. There's if we think about how the internet might continue to be monetized, particularly if we move away from advertising models, then what's that going to look like in other spaces as well? But then, of course, there's also the issues with money muling and the intersection between those as well, because, of course, money muling is also taking place through microtransactions in games. And we've done work with CIFAS to produce some lessons about fraud, but as always, trying to keep up, basically.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions from Twitter here about that, about an issue around monetary problems is that many birthday parties will result in friends giving children a Xbox voucher, and which means and then they have maybe £100 to suddenly spend. So it's this kind of autonomy that comes into it. Is there a way, do we reduce the impact, but how do we harness that opportunity as well?
I mean, there's nothing wrong with giving someone an Xbox voucher or any other reputable gaming brand, to be clear. But I guess the thing that we always think about in PSH is, yeah, you get the maths to learn about budgeting, but what about the influences on your decision making? So if you're thinking about what am I going to buy with this, what's going to be most valuable, is it going to be most valuable to spend £100 on fripperies for your online character? Or is it going to be more valuable to buy a new game, or to, well, my gaming knowledge is slightly running out, but to do something else, basically. So I think it's not about saying, oh gosh, no, we must remove, because of course gaming for many young people is their route into the internet. And that's another thing that we need to think about, the fact that, again, with the gaming platforms potentially becoming really fundamental in any future that may involve the metaverse. What are young people learning as they're playing these games as well in terms of finance? Again, it just comes back to me that these are children's playgrounds and they're rapaciously commercial places. And that's always been a problem when we've thought about online advertising, but this is as pernicious and even more direct.
And Tracy, the work that you're seeing, do you see there's this crossover, like the exploitation of giving a bank card, but increasingly that link between social media spaces, or I'm getting spammed on Instagram with, hey, make money quick with this cryptocurrency thing, or kind of, I need your help, can you send me, and if I'm getting those, imagine what a 15, 16-year-old is seeing online. Are you seeing that in the work that you're doing, a kind of link between the digital space?
Definitely those approaches via the social media channels, so TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, where children are being approached via those channels to provide their bank account details, to whatever it may be, that we would look at it and, like you've just said, you're forever being approached and asked for these details and you just take no notice of it. Whereas a child, especially like we heard earlier about child poverty, and if they think actually my family is really struggling and there is no money for new trainers and the latest gadgets and things like that, and then they're being offered this quick money of, if you do this, you'll earn £50. Well, that's quick money, and it's really easy to see how they can be dragged in, because it's just literally, it's like a child in a sweet shop. It's just appealing to everything that they want.
And that some of the descriptions there strikes me, David, of the work that you've been doing about the gaming world is coming into those scams, and I think that seems to be a common factor. How, looking ahead, and John had touched on this, the kind of metaverse, is gaming driving the future of the metaverse?
So I think this is really interesting, because these are the kind of issues that I believe we will see emerging in the gaming space over the next 5 years. So you have this, we talk about the metaverse a lot, and I think we use it kind of as a shorthand for like a shared virtual consensus reality. And there are lots of big stakeholders who put lots of money on the table saying we think we're going to drive it, and we think of companies like Meta. But other companies are also doing metaversal things now that might end up being even more dominant than the products that Meta are putting out. I think you mentioned Roblox. That's a great example of a shared consensus reality for young people. What if that is the prototype for the future, rather than whatever Meta is putting out? And certainly big video games companies are staking billions on this idea of a metaverse. If that's what happens, then all the issues we're talking about today in gaming become the prototype for where we are all spending the rest of our lives. So I think we need to think really hard about how to make that alternative reality a utopia rather than a dystopia, because I think if we take the blueprints that we are working with right now, in 30, 40 years' time, we're all living in a world that maybe we don't want to live in.
It's this convergence of the gaming world and the financial fraud world seems to be a risk that we've not really thought about. Thinking back to Faye's opening about media literacy, where do you think, is there a link between all of this and media literacy and the points that Faith brought out? Just how, there's a media literacy strategy. As a final thought, what do you think would be useful in a media literacy strategy that responds to financial literacy?
I mean, I think, again, it is about, as with media literacy, ensuring that you're not necessarily siloing issues into here's our lesson on monetization in games. You might do that explicitly. But if we are talking about how are you going to be critical and use processes of inquiry in any space you are, including online, then incorporating those financial aspects, which do seem to be things which are obviously, they're psychological pulls. They will drive you in particular directions to do particular things. So at that point, standing back and being critical in that space, I think that's where it comes in. But that's where we need to, again, it's increasing. I think one of the things that concerns me is we're talking about this today, obviously your research, you were looking at loot boxes going back to 2014, the incorporation of these. In those times, we lack an effective feedback loop between the exponential changes taking place in technology, both at a technological level and at the level of how is money being made, and linking that back into the education system. And I think one of the reasons we've not looked at this across the piece in terms of child financial harms is a failure to look at money. You know, when we were doing a lot of work on pornography, Game was saying, like, it's not about sex, it's about money. And this is about money, and regulation, where regulation could come into this space, is actually looking about where's market. We can regulate in a way that will lead to a few big players having all of the market power and then being able to actually incorporate these systems sort of to the ends of a single entity, or we can do it in a way that doesn't enable that and may enable more of an ecosystem that may enable us to have a better routes for young people not being exploited by the companies themselves. So as always, it's just, you know, follow the money.
And bringing it, is there an appetite in the financial sector to address some of these issues and to, it's an unusual gathering potentially to bring together. Do you see that amongst your colleagues in the finance sector?
Definitely. I think we've all got that duty, certainly even from like a corporate social responsibility perspective, that we need to keep children safe online. And I've already had the conversation with David saying, actually, I need to introduce him to our Intel team so that we can work closer together and see exactly what we need to be doing. Obviously, we've got the school lesson plans as well. So we're just about to relaunch those. They've been updated, but it's very much having to constantly keep on track of what children are doing online, because literally you can publish something one day and it's out of date the next day because something else has come out.
And looking ahead, David, your research, you've been looking at the trends. Where do you, you were talking about where this follow the money point. We talked previously about where some of this money is being spent, NFTs and skins that you mentioned were £2, but we see headlines for skins that are spent for thousands of pounds. What's the future of these transactions?
I think that's a great question. And I think if we look at the direction of travel we've been in, we've seen an increasing overlap between the real world and the virtual world in a number of ways that I don't think we would have predicted 10 or 20 years ago. So I think 20 years ago, people were still talking about immersive virtual environments as if the important thing about them was that they were stories. So we talked a lot about the content, right? We were really worried about violence in games and violence on TV and things like that, or maybe depictions of drugs or sex. But I think we've increasingly started to see a more thorough overlap between the virtual and the real, where we realize that they're not just stories, they're actually fully, you said playgrounds earlier, I think that's a really, really good analogy. It's a virtual world, and therefore all of the strategies and all the risks, all the strategies that you have to deal with risks and all the risks that exist in the real world will be replicated in these virtual spaces. And I think that's what's going to happen more and more with money. Money is going to become increasingly real in the virtual world, and virtual items are going to hold increasing value and all the fraud and financial issues that come with that.
I remember hearing a young person say that they said, oh, well, the internet was just built to sell adverts and they wanted to get rid of it. And it made me quite sad, and it just feels like we're at a similar point. We've got a chance to kind of create a more common space rather than a modification that's been happening so far. Well, I'd like to thank all the guests today and thank all the speakers so far. And if you've got more questions for anybody today, it's Digital Families 22. We're standing between you and lunch, so we'll move off stage quickly now. But thank you very much to David, John, and